I want to talk about, well, let me give you the title of this talk, and actually it's a lot, Jeff, about what you're talking about, is how much I love being here and why I love it. And the title of the talk is Leaving Eden, Constructing Community in Today's Schools. And you'll see why in a moment, but a number of you have asked whether today I'd be talking in any way about those incidents of intolerance that we witnessed recently. But I want to do so by talking about what community means, and I actually want to get to a higher altitude so that we can have a wider view, almost a kind of historical and contextual view that I think would be helpful. And the topic is this. The topic is, how do you craft a healthy, functioning community, which is comprised of hundreds of adolescents and adults with diverse perspectives, experiences, and needs, where new members arrive annually, every fall, and where the challenges and the issues of the real world always intrude. And so, in a way, yes, recent incidents inform the talk, but I want to be clear that I think this challenge is much larger than any single incident or even plural incidents. The talk is about the larger work of schools today and how that work differs than yesterday. And I say that, I think, with a little bit of perspective as someone who's been here a long time, but also as someone who's just interested in the history of private education. Begin here. When Horace Taft retired in 1936, after 46 years of being the head, he moved into a Greek revival house right around the corner. And a couple years into his retirement, he was in an interview, and he was asked, "What changes have you witnessed in your days?" And I quote him, he said, "The boys of today are made of the same stuff, good, bad, and indifferent. The only trouble is they need to be a great deal better. The movies, the radio, the automobile make it much more difficult for boys at Taft to lead a simple life." Now, when we hear this, there's a certain naivete, isn't there, that, oh my God, the radio caused problems. But what he was saying was this, that the school of his last years was more complex than the one he had founded, where his vision was for something simpler, perhaps even more innocent. And of course, there's no way he could have foreseen how much more complicated these places would be. Were he suddenly to land in the main hall and walk down past my office, I think he would shake his head in awe and in pride at seeing a school utterly unlike his own, but also perhaps confused as he saw challenges that he never, ever could have dreamed of. Now, as you know, the school was founded in 1890. And what's interesting is if you look at the seals or signs of many private secondary schools in New England, you'll notice that a vast number of them were founded between 1890 and 1920. So what happened in these 3 decades? Well, there's books that have been written about it, but the short answer is this. Boarding schools emerged at the turn of that century in order to get adolescents away from their parents and out of the cities. In the way of thinking at the time, in the Gilded Age of growing affluence, and as a time when we were seeing millions of immigrants coming into this country, parents were seen as somehow too indulgent, and cities were seen as dangerous. So new schools sprang up to provide a sanctuary from all that the city represented: affluence, vice, immigration, moral decay, disease. And so the locations of these schools were invariably rural. By the way, that's why even the day schools have names like Country Day. They were invariably rural. They saw themselves as functioning in place of parents, and they were isolated from all social evils. Our Dean of Faculty, Edie Traina, tells me that in the academic study of geography, these are what are called self-sufficient systems. That is, essentially enclosed, largely inward-focused, and robustly defended from all that was outside. Now, the English teacher in me puts it more metaphorically, meaning I think these schools aspired to be kind of educational Edens, innocent and untouched. So boarding schools at the time met the social and educational needs of a largely upper-class white Christian market that was seeking sanctuary from affluence and urbanization. And if you listen to the partial list, and this is just a partial list of schools founded in 1880 to 1910, these are what we now see as great schools. Remember, at this time, they were just startups. They were schools no one had ever heard of. Partial list: Thatcher, Lawrenceville, Groton, Woodbury Forest, Taft, Hotchkiss, Choate, St. Mark's, St. George's, Middlesex, Salisbury, Trinity Pawling, Kent, Westminster, Westover. So the history of this school is typical. You know the story. He founded the school, Horace Taft founded the school in 1890 in Pelham Manor. But his decision to move it 3 years later was in part, and I quote him here, because we were all together too near New York. I find that interesting. Watertown, green, quiet, nestled among hills and farms, was attractive. He built a fence, he erected two pillars, he hung a gate and started a school. And so schools like Taft began, I would argue, as experiments in a garden. They had hedges and walls around them, both literally and figuratively. There were gates through only a few could pass. So in geography and enrollment and philosophy, they worked very hard to push back on society's trends and to stand in a kind of sequestered and innocent isolation. But in fact, Taft and other schools, the Kents and Grottons and Hotchkisses, they never were Edens. Despite the efforts of their founders and their leaders, they were always touched by the outside world, as Taft seemed to be lamenting from his retirement home when he spoke of automobiles and radios. And that tension would mark these schools forever, that tension between an aspiration towards isolated innocence and from the reality that the real world always intruded. To be clear, for starters, remember this, they were fully human organizations. And that alone should tell us that they had to be imperfect, that they never could be an Eden. Every student and teacher brought with him, and of course at that time it was mainly hymns, every student or teacher brought with him the baggage that humans lug around everywhere, prejudices, fears, stereotypes, misunderstanding, and ignorance. Students were not blank slates. They were not tabula rosas on which we wrote our values. Every year saw a senior class graduate and a new one replace it, no different than today. It was as if they were immigrants, as it were, strangers to culture, adjusting to values and carrying their own personal luggage. So from the start, they were human organizations. Further, the very idea that the social, political, and technological forces of the day somehow yielded at the main gates was a fallacy. Their practices and policies sought vainly to keep the world at bay. As I say, look at rules prohibiting the ownership of radios, and then later TVs, and then later phones. Look at how rarely they were permitted to go home, how rarely families were invited to campus. But on this campus, the influenza outbreak in 1918 sickened many and killed one, and that may be all the metaphor we need to be reminded that the outside world will always intrude into our world, despite those efforts. And that's why the dining hall served little meat during the Depression, why plane spotting clubs sprung up in World War II, why the science curriculum changed after the launch of Sputnik, why there were editorials about the Vietnam War penned in the papyrus in the 60s. But even with schools living within this tension, and I want you to understand that tension, even with the evidence that the messy challenges of the external world intruded, even acknowledging that students every year brought in values that may have been at odds with the school, even acknowledging all that, I want to be clear that creating community was, compared to today, a simpler task. Now, all this would change, and history would show that the most significant change in private education was the decision by schools to actually try to become very different kinds of schools. And we need a different kind of metaphor to understand it. If the gates to the outside world were narrow in the early decades of private secondary schools, by the 1960s, a very different ethos had taken hold, not just at Taft, but indeed all of our brother and sister schools. That is, the tight gates were replaced by a steadily widening mainstream. Geographers would say that that self-sufficient model that I described had been replaced by an international one. No longer isolated, engaged externally, shaped by relationships, and infinitely more dynamic. And so beginning in the 1960s, schools and colleges, some of the colleges you went to, you'll recognize this history, they changed their thinking in a way that would alter their histories, and I might even argue alter the history of this nation as a consequence. They sought and welcomed a much more diverse student body, and they adopted bold policies to ensure that that could happen. That somewhat simpler school made of boys with very similar beliefs and backgrounds became, almost within a single generation, far more complicated. In gender, class, race, ethnicity, nationality, and religion, schools like Taft worked towards becoming everything they were not at their founding. In the history of private education, there is no change that is more profound than this. It was as if schools woke up some point in the 60s, by 1970, threw out the aspirations of their founding, flung open their gates, Eden no more. And so during that time, the mainstream became incrementally wider, and then beginning in the 1970s and accelerating in subsequent years, the mainstream widened significantly. It was for Taft one of the Board of Trustees' highest priorities, as it remains today. And so over the next decades, and these decades coincided with my years here as a student and then my early years teaching all the way up to today, Taft became a school of radically different diversity. Girls were admitted, and then students of all colors, nations, faith, ethnicities, sexual orientation, and economic class. And that's the school you see today when you walk the halls, diverse in incredibly exciting ways. But there's a truth that accompanies such a change, and it should surprise no one, and it's this: that if you craft a community like this every year, making it function is going to be much, much harder work than when your school aspired towards something simpler. I think that the story of Eden has always told us that, right? Innocence is easy, knowledge is hard. And at Taft, no different than any of our peers, we had new questions to answer and then new opportunities to seize. How do you help students develop the skills to navigate a diverse campus? How do you balance the celebration of individuality and the need for a coming together in community? How do you reconcile so many competing needs? How do you hire and equip the faculty for this kind of campus? In what way does the academic curriculum change? How do you ensure that every student feels included? And on and on. So if you go back to that mainstream metaphor, I think of it in this way. The boy at Taft, let's say in 1955, did not live and learn in as diverse a school as today. It is not to say that he didn't receive a great education or that Taft was not challenging. He did, and it was. But on that somewhat narrower lane, the traffic was less crowded and generally going in a similar direction, and maybe even more or less at the same speed. School probably felt less complicated. And that's not the case today. The mainstream may be significantly wider, but it's also filled with vastly different ways of navigating that crowded to commute towards college and adulthood. And it is in equal measure thrilling and difficult, and I think that's the school you saw today. And my guess is it's partly because that's the school you saw that you chose it. So this change is profoundly important, I think. Our work has always been hard. They are teenagers after all. That's always been the case. What's different is that we are now a place of such astonishing complexity, and the opportunity now and all that's required here is our best thinking, and it makes for a work that never ends. In short, if these conditions are exciting, they're also challenging. And this brings us to the work that occupies schools, and by the way, colleges, as you know, more intensely than ever. Creating functioning community in a place marked by complexity. It is a challenge of a very different scale than even a generation ago. So let me suggest I'm going to suggest 5 things I think schools need to do and to recognize. First is this. What is clear is that even as a place as diverse as this, there are students who do not feel included, who become, because of some way of identifying themselves, perhaps race or class or sexuality or nationality, feel marginalized. They don't feel included in the traffic of the mainstream that I described, and they feel somehow left on the edges. And too often they have heard words or felt acts that have left them alone or fatigued or even scarred. I've heard this from courageous alumni and current students, and it's a reminder that widening does not inevitably bring inclusion. That this has been our history is sad, that our present is tragic. And even as we are not alone as a school in any way, I simply won't accept it as inevitable. And I see confronting this as our challenge and an opportunity. Here's the second. I think we can never accept violations of our core values of respect and kindness and inclusion as the inevitable or acceptable price of your community's diversity. I refuse to accept that. Yes, it's a more complex school in the past, and mediating conflict and resolving competing needs and solving problems, yes, those are harder than ever. But it doesn't mean that you ever stop saying that there are behaviors which we will not tolerate and are at odds with everything we are. Third, I think this. it comes back to that original point. I think we have to recognize that crafting community at a school like ours is going to require heavy, fatiguing, and unending labor. Work that has no single solution, and work that requires the most stubborn and optimistic faith, the deepest trust and empathy, I think the sturdiest resolve, and the bravest institutional honesty. Otherwise, how do you get better and how do you change? Schools only a few decades ago never would have wondered how to manage the issues that arise, for instance, when you have some 40 nations on campus, many of which have complicated shared histories, or queried how to recognize the spiritual needs of so many religions on a campus, or read literature that would be experienced in vastly different ways by students of different race and ethnicity, or taught history that would be understood in diverse ways by those living with a conflicting legacy of that history. It is really hard. There will be lots of disagreement. I think patience will be needed and trust will be vital. Fourth, I think the work of inclusion and multiculturalism at a place like this, I don't believe it can be accomplished by checking the box of a mandated course, an approach with what I think is a dangerous suggestion that the work is finished in one place at one time by one person. But let me be clear, nor do I think it can be met only through the mere assumption that the various threads of the school will somehow weave themselves together to create some strong rope of understanding. I think both will be required, both. I think creative schools are going to look for many required spaces for learning, whether that's courses, outside speakers, programs, and training, that is, mandates. But I think we also have to look at the more expansive and organic and pervasive ways in which, through academics, residential life, athletics, clubs, and advisors, this work happens. So I am reminded of that quote, the genius of the and not the tyranny of the or. I don't think this is a question of either or. I think both of these are necessary. And then finally, I think we should make a really critical distinction. That is, between the healthy and educational ways students are made to feel challenged and even uncomfortable, and acts and words that are demeaning or cruel and harassing. These are very, very different things. Every student at this school, your sons and daughters, every one of them has a right to be included, to be allowed to be their full self, to learn and live free of bullying and harassment. There is no negotiation on that. But I also think we should recognize that it is in being challenged and even being made uncomfortable that we learn and we grow, and frankly, we are prepared for life. A school can be welcoming and civil and also robustly disagreeable in the free exchange of ideas. If we are doing our job as faculty, and I think if students are pushing themselves as they will, then students will at times feel uncomfortable, just as they are on the athletic field or the dramatic stage, where they stretch and risk and grow. Our role as caring adults, I think, is to be there and to help them in those moments. It may come in a smart and lively class where your son has a view that others don't share in the interpretation of a poem, in the solution of a calculus problem, or in the defense of a historical interpretation. It may come in the common room or lunch table or club meeting where your daughter offers a perspective on a current event or an outside speaker or public policy that others disagree with her. I think this is how the habit of empathy is practiced. I think it's how we become sturdier thinkers. I think it's how we become more nuanced listeners, and how all minds are open to change. There is learning here for all. So I hope that we will try to accomplish those 5 things. And again, those 5, that we work so every student feels included, that we refuse to accept acts of intolerance, that we recognize that community labor is hard and unending, that we use both structural and more organic approaches to developing understanding, and that we create open and robust and respectful discourse. And I think that if a school has the stamina and the patience, the goodwill, I would even add the humor at times to do this, then it'll be meeting what I believe, without question today, is the greatest challenge schools and colleges face. So let me bring us to a close. Some of you might hear that history of private education and say, Willy, don't you wish for those simpler days? And if you'd ask me on my 3rd sleepless night, the answer would be yes. But no, I don't. Of course I don't. I love the complexity, the noise, the traffic, even the messiness. I love the opportunities that we are given. I love the conviction that we all share that this is important work we do together. I love the way our best angels become visible through the struggles. I think it's right. I think it's what you should want if you want your child to be prepared for life after Taft. You see, your sons and daughters will enter a future which I think is at once so tightly interconnected, but also increasingly fractured and tribal. And they're going to be enrolled in colleges and work in corporations and offices and the military and NGOs and hospitals and startups. And these will be highly complex organizations. And to thrive, they are going to need a unique set of skills and habits. And to be clear, these are more sophisticated skills than you and I had when we graduated. And I believe that they can only acquire them in a place that is as complicated as this. Eden was never a good rehearsal. So I have faith in your children. So does every teacher on the campus. That faith is never shaken. It's why we chose this work. It is true teenagers bring their worlds with them. It is true they will always do dumb and bad and wrong things. That's why this is called a school. And if they occasionally drive me crazy, they also lift me up. I want them putting their devices down and talking, listening, debating, discussing, questioning, creating, collaborating, disagreeing, supporting, compromising, solving, crying, laughing, and loving with each other. With friends with whom they share everything, and peers who could not be more different, in classes and in the dining hall, on teams and in the dorms. I think that's why you sent your children here, and to honor those dreams of yours, we are trying to craft a community that is at once beautiful and flawed and delicate and sturdy, with the hope that it will provide them both opportunity and challenge. And if the faculty, and it is the faculty and I can succeed in our labors, if we can be tireless in serving this school, if we can include and challenge every student, if we can be stubborn in our aspirations for improvement, well then maybe your children will learn how to navigate this traffic of competing needs and desires, and maybe they will take part in the free and robust exchange of ideas. Maybe they will learn to stand for things they believe in. Maybe they will empathize with the experience of others. Maybe they will be open to change and new ideas. Maybe they will defend those who've been left behind. And the idea that this might happen on any given day, on every corner of the campus, makes me think that we faculty have chosen a beautiful vocation, and it makes me hope that you feel you've chosen the right school. So it's in that spirit, and with just enormous thanks for all that you do, and with the hope that you have a great day, I welcome you to Parents' Day and look forward to seeing you all day. So thank you so much.